Come to order. We just got notice that the rule was voice voted. They were going to have a vote about 10, so they said final votes will be at about 10:45. So we'll start to get as far into it as we can, and then we'll go vote, and with your patience, we'll be back as quickly as we can. Good morning. Thank you for joining us today as we consider the President's fiscal year 2013 budget request for the Department of the Army. Secretary McHugh, General Odierno, thank you for being here. Secretary McHugh, it's great to see you again. Thank you for your continued service. General Odierno, the 38th Chief of Staff of the Army, welcome to your first of many posture hearings. I'm sure you're glad to hear that. Our nation's very fortunate to have the two of you leading our Army during these challenging times. We clearly understand the challenges the Department of the Army faced in crafting this budget request, and we know you probably wouldn't be here if you didn't strongly support it. What it boils down to is, based on this budget request, what is the risk associated with the Army's ability to meet the national security needs of this nation? This is what we need your help with, not only the risks, but the critical assumptions behind these risks. Many years ago, the Army testified in front of the House Subcommittee on Armed Services. I'd like to read 3 quotes from the Army's testimony. We have the best men in the Army today that we've ever had in peacetime. And although we have a number of critical equipment problems yet to solve, I can assure you that our troops, with the equipment they have, would give a good account of themselves if called upon. Within a fixed budget, the Army can obtain greatest effectiveness only by maintaining a delicate balance between personnel and equipment. We're supporting this budget that will provide only 10 divisions because we realize the necessity to integrate Army requirements with those of the other services within our national budget. And we will, of course, do everything within our power to lessen the risk that such a reduction must by necessity entail. These statements were made in January 1950. 6 months later, a 500-man battalion-sized task force from the 24th Infantry Division, under Lieutenant Colonel Charles Smith, Task Force Smith, was rushed to Korea on transport planes to block the North Korean advance. You know the rest of the story. Task Force Smith was outnumbered 10-1, and although they inflicted 127 casualties, the task force suffered 181 casualties. It's worth noting that more soldiers weren't sent with Task Force Smith because the Air Force didn't have enough transport planes. It's worth noting that 2.36-inch bazookas that Task Force Smith fired at the North Korean T-34 tanks just bounced off and had no effect. The modernized 3.5 bazooka had been developed at the end of World War II, but was terminated because of budget cuts. The point is that you can have a well-led, trained, and equipped force, and it can still be hollow if it isn't properly modernized and if you can't get it to the right place at the right time. Please help the members of this committee understand how, under the context of the budget before us, the Army is prepared to avoid the mistakes that led to Task Force Smith. Finally, and I really mean this, I can't think of a better team than Secretary McHugh and General Odierno to lead our Army during these challenging times. Again, thank you both for your selfless service, and I look forward to your testimony. Ranking Member Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I, too, want to join you in your thanks and praise for General Odierno and Secretary McHugh. We could not possibly have 2 more capable folks leading the Army. Appreciate your hard work on behalf of our country, and we particularly appreciate all the hard work that our soldiers have done over the course of the last 10 years, fighting 2 major ground wars and fighting them very, very well. They performed at the expectations that I'm sure we all had for them, but still very, very high level. We appreciate the sacrifices that all of the soldiers have made in the last 10 years and their family. And I believe the Chairman laid out correctly the challenge that we face as we've now drawn down in Iraq and we begin to draw down in Afghanistan, that means major changes for all the services, certainly, but for the Army in particular as the largest force that was and is deployed in those two locations. How do we do that responsibly? How do we make sure that as we change the size of the force, as we change where they are deployed, we meet the requirements of our strategy and of our national security needs? And I completely agree with the Chairman that that's most what this committee wants to hear from you and what we are most focused on working with you on in the months ahead as we put together this budget and get ready for those changes. Now, I think the reality is, and we have this debate on this committee, is this being driven by budget or driven by strategy? I suspect that will come up a time or two during the course of the questioning. And of course, the truth of the matter is, it's as with any project that involves money, it's driven by both. You have your strategy and you have your budget. I have not yet come across the group that has an infinite budget. You have to live within what the budget is and figure out how to make the strategy work. But I do believe that the services did this the right way. They really started thinking about this 6 months to a year ago, putting together a comprehensive strategy in light of many of the facts that both the Chairman and I have talked about, and put together a strategy that makes a great deal of sense and that fits the budget. Now, you would like to have more money. We would all like to have more money, but we don't. We ran a $1.3 trillion deficit last year, and that's about 38% of the budget. And that is an enormous challenge, not something that can be ignored. And it is also a threat to our national security. As you go back through history, you can see many examples of nations that ultimately lost wars because they didn't have the economic wherewithal to fight them. Yes, we would like to be absolutely 100% ready for everything that could possibly happen. Now, I don't think anybody in the history of the world has ever been 100% ready for anything that could possibly happen. But we also have to understand, if we spend ourselves into such a massive deficit and economically weak condition, we then won't even be able to respond when the crisis has come, because the rest of the story, obviously, from Korea is that we did respond. We grew the Army. We built more equipment, just like we did in World War II, just like we've done in every war we've fought. We did not anticipate too many of them, if any of them. We have to be in a position to economically respond, to build the equipment and grow the force to meet that challenge. So we have to do both, and I recognize that you gentlemen are trying to balance those two legitimate needs. Meet the strategy, but also make sure that we have a budget that's going to work economically in this country so that we don't so weaken ourselves economically that we're not in a position to fight our wars and protect ourselves. That's a difficult challenge in this current environment, but as the Chairman said, and I'll end on this note of agreement, we couldn't ask for two better people to help us meet that challenge. We look forward to your testimony and to your answers to our questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman McKeon, Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, first of all, I'm humbled by your kind comments, and I'll try to work as hard as I possibly can to measure up to even half of them, but I'm deeply appreciative. And it's great to be back in this room, although those chairs are far more comfortable than these chairs are, I found. But nevertheless, this is always an honor for me, and I'm honored to be here. I want to add my words to yours, Mr. Chairman, of appreciation and welcome to our 38th Chief of Staff of the Army. I hope I can keep this one longer than I kept the last one. But even in the relatively short time that General Odierno has been with us, he has shown that he is more than up to the task, and it is a pleasure to work with him each and every day. And I think, as you have said, both you and Mr. Smith, that we're blessed to have such a great leader in such an important time. And while I'm on the matter of thanks, I certainly would be remiss if I didn't thank each and every one of you. I may be somewhat biased, but after 17 years on this side of the Potomac and now nearly 2.5 on the other, I think I have a great appreciation, and I know I have a deep admiration for the incredible work that this committee does, for the vital role that it plays in building our national defense, and of course in the Army's case, making sure that we have the processes, the procedures, the rules, the laws, the money to do the right thing by these amazing men and women, some 1.1 million strong. Today, as has been noted, more than ever, our demanding fiscal environment requires us to have an even stronger partnership with this committee, with this Congress, and I promise you we'll do everything we can to see that that happens. we have a shared responsibility. One, to make sure we have the right resources to defeat our enemies, to supply and protect and support our allies, and make sure that our homeland remains safe. And we need to do it responsibly, decisively, and yes, we need to do it affordably. And the budget that you have before you supports these goals by laying the foundation for a gradual reduction of our military and civilian end strength, while at the same time supporting the vital modernization, training, soldier and family programs necessary so that the Army, though smaller, remains the strongest and most capable, most lethal land force anywhere in the world. As we implement what I believe can be fairly described as a bold new security strategy, I want to be clear. The Army's combat expertise, adaptability, and strategic reach will be more vital than ever before. Over the last year, the Army has continued to be the decisive hand of American foreign policy and the helping hand of America's facing the devastation of natural disasters. From Iraq and its deserts to the Afghan mountains to the Philippine jungles and Korea Peninsula, our soldiers, active, guard, and reserve, have continued to fight insurgents, defeat terrorists, stabilize governments, and support our allies. In December, after some 8 years of combat and stability efforts, the Army successfully concluded Operation New Dawn, leaving behind a fledgling democracy and a nation that once knew only tyranny. In an unprecedented logistical feat, our soldiers completed one of the largest retrograde operations in the history of warfare, removing over 3.4 million pieces of equipment. Moreover, we continue to support the efforts of the State Department as it works closely with the Iraqi government to further bolster freedom, prosperity, and stability in that nation. In Afghanistan, the Army has made steady progress in fighting al-Qaeda terrorists and Taliban insurgents, as well as training thousands of Afghan security forces, from conducting extensive regular and special operations to providing essential logistics, transportation, medical, and communication support for the entire joint force. Soldiers are at the forefront of U.S. operations and success. But over the last year, your Army did even more, with soldiers deployed on 6 of 7 continents in more than 150 nations around the world. Beyond that, in 2011, we saw our citizens experience some of the worst natural disasters in our nation's history, from responding to wildfires and floods to hurricanes and tornadoes. Our soldiers and civilians from all components were there to help, protect, rescue, and rebuild. Simply put, our soldiers, civilians, and their families have once again proven why the United States Army is the most capable, versatile, and successful land force on earth. And it is this ability to adapt to a myriad of unpredictable threats, both at home and abroad, that we will maintain as we move forward in this new security and fiscal environment. This year's budget portrays an Army fully embracing change by making hard decisions now to lay the right foundation for the future. First, we are implementing a sweeping new defense strategy which emphasizes even greater engagement in the Asia-Pacific region in the development of smaller, more agile land forces. Under this framework, which was developed collaboratively with the top military and civilian officials in our department, the Army clearly remains the decisive arm of U.S. combat power. Our balanced and transformed force will continue to be the most capable anywhere in the world. That is our standard. That is what the strategy requires, and that is what this budget supports. Second, we're implementing this new paradigm under the significant cuts directed by the Budget Control Act. In doing so, we made tough decisions, but we are guided always by the following principles. One, we will fully support the current fight by providing the operational commanders in Afghanistan and other theaters with the best trained and ready land forces in the world. This remains our top priority. Two, we will not sacrifice readiness for force structure. We must responsibly reduce our end strength in a manner that fully supports the new strategy, but also provides the sufficient time to properly balance our training, equipment, infrastructure, and soldier and family support programs with our mission requirements. Next, we'll be able to build force structure and capabilities to handle unforeseen changes to global security. The Army must be able to hedge risk through an efficient and effective force generation process and access to a strong, operationalized reserve component. Next, we will maintain and enhance the Army's extensive commitments in the Pacific. Finally, we'll not let the Budget Control Act cuts be taken on the backs of our soldiers or their families. Although we have and will continue to examine all of our programs, we will fully fund those support systems that work with special emphasis on wounded warrior, suicide prevention, behavioral health, and sexual assault programs. Based on these principles, our budget minimizes end strength reductions in 13 to support the current fight, emphasizes continued investments in vital modernization programs such as the network, ground combat vehicle, and the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, delays or eliminates programs which no longer meet urgent needs in support of our new strategy or transforming force, and defers certain military construction programs. The Army at its core is not programs and systems, it's people. Each time before you, I come not just as a secretary, but humbly as the representative of our soldiers, civilians, and their families. As everyone in this room knows so well, these brave men and women who have endured so much over the past decade depend upon a variety of programs, policies, and facilities to cope with the stress, injuries, and family separation caused by war. Sadly, tragically, our suicide and substance abuse rates remain unacceptably high, and we're aggressively pursuing multiple avenues to provide our personnel with the best medical and behavioral health support available. We must never forget that our success in both Iraq and Afghanistan has come at an incredibly high price to our Army family. Providing the means and resources for whatever challenges they now face is, in my opinion, the very least we must do. As a final note regarding our Army family, I'd be remiss if I failed to mention the devastating impact that sequestration would have, not only on the Army's programs, systems, and readiness, but also on our soldiers, civilians, and their families. Sadly, they too would bear the cost of continued inaction leading to sequestration. To use an axe to cut $500 billion from defense spending would be perilous enough. But to do so without providing the Department with any means of managing those reductions would be beyond risky. To say this would be unacceptable is, at least in my opinion, an understatement. In conclusion, on behalf of the men and women of our Army, let me thank you again for your thoughtful oversight, unwavering support, and proud partnership. Today, your Army has succeeded in Iraq, is making progress in Afghanistan, and as this budget, I feel, demonstrates, is poised to transform into a new, smaller, and more balanced force ready to meet the needs, all the needs, of this nation's national defense. I want to be clear, very clear. These are extraordinarily challenging times, globally and fiscally. Our strategy in this budget reflect very hard decisions that will impact communities, industry, and people. We know that. We know it well. And I promise you we'll do everything we can to minimize these effects. But in the end, to make a properly balanced Army that can stay ahead of our competitors and support our greatest asset, our soldiers, we must restructure, we must reprioritize. We have begun this effort, and with your continued leadership and help, we will succeed. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. General Odierno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, distinguished members of the committee, it's an honor to be here in front of you today, and I want to first thank you for the incredible support you've continued to give our soldiers today and over the past 10 years specifically as we fought in wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and around the world. We couldn't have done it without your support, your guidance, and your partnership that we've had. I appreciate the vote of confidence from Secretary McHugh, but in reality, it is I relying strongly on his wisdom and experience to guide me through my first posture hearings as the Chief. We are very fortunate to have Secretary McHugh leading our Army. He deeply cares about our institution and its role in providing our nation's security, and I could not ask for a better boss. So together here today, both of us, it's a true honor to be here today representing our 1.1 million soldiers and our nearly 280,000 Department of the Army civilians and their 1.4 million family members, I'm extremely proud of the commitment, professionalism, and dedication of our soldiers and their sacrifice and accomplishments. Today, they continue to be in over 150 countries around the world. Collectively, they are a truly globally engaged Army, with 95,000 soldiers deployed and another 96,000 soldiers forward stationed, conducting a broad range of missions. But our Army's primary purpose is steadfast and resolute, to fight and win our nation's wars. As the Army continues its transition, we will ensure the President's 2012 defense strategic priorities are implemented by first meeting our current commitments in Afghanistan and elsewhere by ensuring a highly trained, well-manned, and equipped force. Now that operations in Iraq are complete and we continue surge recovery in Afghanistan, we will help shape the regional environs in support of the combatant commanders, as well as our strategic environment. In the Asia-Pacific, which is home to 7 out of the 10 largest land armies in the world, we will provide an array of tools through rotational forces, multilateral exercises, and other innovative engagements with our allies and new partners. We currently have some 66,000 soldiers and almost 10,000 civilians in this region. In the Middle East, we continue our strong commitment to sustaining and building partner capacity to ensure stability. And in Europe, as we decrease our footprint by 2 brigade combat teams, we will use a series of engagement tools that include rotational forces to conduct training and combined readiness exercises with our allies. This will serve as a model on how I see us doing things in the future, using a low-cost, small-footprint approach by utilizing rotational, regionally aligned forces and pre-positioned stocks. As we move forward, we will ensure our National Guard and Army Reserves remain resourced at an appropriate level to build on the competencies and experiences that have been gained over the past several years. We are committed to maintaining an operational reserve to meet future security requirements. We will adapt our progressive readiness model to do that. We will build on the integration and synchronization gained over the past 10 years between our conventional and special operations forces. The Army's investment in our special operations community in counterterrorism, foreign and internal defense, and other key operational matters is significant, growing onwards to 35,000 elite warriors that provide specialized and unique capabilities. As we look forward, and the Secretary already touched on this a bit, there are several focus areas that will help us guide the way ahead. Foremost, we will remain committed to our 67,000 warfighters in Afghanistan and continue to provide trained and ready equipped soldiers to win that fight. We will be responsible governmental stewards through energy cost savings and institutional and acquisition reform. And we will continue our equipment reset program to restore unit equipment to a desired level of capability that is commensurate with their future missions. There have been over 1.8 million pieces of equipment reset to date, which equates to approximately 31 brigade equivalents annually. And finally, we will become leaner. With a leaner Army, we have to prioritize, yet we must never sacrifice our capability of meeting a wide range of security requirements. This requires a delicate balance of end strength, modernization, and readiness, as we cannot afford to reduce too much too soon. With the end of Operation New Dawn and new defense priorities, we will reduce our end strength and force structure in the active Army from 570,000 to 490,000, from 358,000 to 353,500 in the Army National Guard, and from 206,000 to 205,000 in the Army Reserve. It is imperative for us to sustain a gradual ramp that will allow us to take care of our soldiers, continue to provide forces for Afghanistan, and facilitate reversibility if necessary over the next 5 years. This helps mitigate strategic risks as we continue current operations and simultaneously reset for the future. We will also reduce our end strength by a minimum of 8 brigade combat teams in the active component. This drawdown, based on our national strategic objectives, will be done with deliberate consideration to the impacts on combatant commander requirements, as well as considerations on local communities and infrastructure. We are in the process of reviewing our brigade combat team design as we analyze lessons learned from the past 10 years of combat and look to what future capabilities we will need to be successful. While we are a few months away from decision, initial analysis indicates we can eliminate some unnecessary overhead while sustaining more robust, flexible, adaptable brigade combat teams. This could result in additional BCT headquarters reductions while sustaining combat capability at the battalion level. Army unit readiness is measured by the level of its manning, training, and equipping. As a component of readiness, we will continue to provide first-rate support for all our families, wounded warriors, and our veterans. Additionally, the Secretary and I pledge our support for the proposed reforms in military compensation programs. We are reinforcing the professional ethics centered around trust and respect in order to establish a climate where sexual harassment, sexual assault, and hazing will not be tolerated. This misconduct is inconsistent with the core values of our profession. Accountability will be enforced at all levels. Similarly, the Secretary and I are relooking the role of women in combat, as they comprise 15.6% of our active duty workforce. This will start with the opportunity for women to serve in their designated field regardless the type of unit. It is about managing talent and putting our best people in critical and developmental positions. As we continue to transform our modernization practices through a holistic bottom-up approach, we must achieve our priorities of the network, which is critical to our ability to manage information and command our forces at all levels, both home and abroad. The ground combat vehicle, the replacement for our infantry fighting vehicle that can accommodate an infantry squad and balance mobility and survivability and provide unmatched lethality on the battlefield against current and future threats. The more mobile, survivable, network-integrated Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, which both myself and General Amos agree is necessary given the last 10 years of fighting and what future operations may entail. And finally, we must have continued efforts to give our squad superiority on the battlefield with advanced soldier systems and weapons, communications, and protections. The Secretary and I will continue to assess and make adjustments to our budget strategy while addressing any potential risk incurred as we adjust our force posture. I'd like to leave you with one last thought. Sequestration is not in the best interest, in my opinion, of our national security. The impact to the Army would be severe reductions in the active and reserve component end strength. It would significantly decrease our readiness and detrimentally impact our modernization programs. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, thank you again for the opportunity to speak here today. This committee affords our all-volunteer Army the most decisive land force in the world, and we could not do it without the support you give us. It is an honor to serve this great nation and stand beside the dedicated professionals of our Army. The strength of our nation is our Army. The strength of our Army is our soldiers. And the strength of our soldiers is our families. And this is what makes us Army strong. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much, General, Mr. Secretary. Last year, we passed the Deficit Reduction Act that took a two-pronged approach to attack the huge deficit problem that we've built over decades of making promises that would be difficult to keep and spending money that we had to borrow to spend. The first prong was the almost $1 trillion that was supposed to come out of discretionary spending. There was a call after the last election that everything should be on the table. And I understand that defense was a big target, and I've repeatedly said if we could not find some savings within a budget of $600 billion plus, shame on us. And I think you've done a great job on that, beginning with the $100 billion of efficiencies, and then the $78 billion, and then what we find now is $487 billion. The second part of that, we had, through the legislation, assigned the super committee to come up with savings, hopefully out of the entitlement programs, because if we don't address the entitlement programs, if we eliminate the total discretionary budget, we still run a deficit of about $500 billion a year. So we could totally wipe out the discretionary budget and not solve the problem, not even really attack the real problem. But we're facing that now. You've done a great job working for months on coming up with the strategies and using the money that you have remaining after these cuts to get us through this problem. The second part of the second prong of that attack, when the super committee was unable to perform its work, is known as sequestration, and that will be another $1.1 to $1.2 trillion that takes effect next January 1st. Again, half of that comes out of defense. Now, defense only accounts for 20% of our budget, but the first tranche, 50% of the savings came out of defense. The second tranche, another 50% of the savings is slated to come out of defense. So that we could look out 10 years and be talking about $100 billion a year cut on defense out of what had been projected in previous budgets. To me, the most pressing need right now is we need to fix the sequestration. If we allow that to move forward and hit us next January 1st, the way it is currently drafted, just across-the-board cuts of either 8%, 12%, depending on if personnel are taken out of the equation. Thinking of all of the multiple contracts, I don't know how many contracts you have out, Mr. Secretary, but I'm sure it's in the hundreds, if not thousands, that would have to be rewritten, renegotiated. I just see total chaos on January 1st of next year if this has not been fixed. I would like to ask you, General, what you're doing, what you're contemplating doing, what planning you may be doing to prepare for the problem that may confront us if we do not address this issue before next January 1st. What will you be doing?
Mr. Chairman, first, we'll continue to wait for guidance from the Secretary of Defense in order to move forward on very specific planning for sequestration. But as I think through this and as we think through the potential that this could have, what I would tell you is that it would result in us having to relook fundamentally how we do business. The reductions that would be required in both our active component and reserve components would be significant. Our readiness profiles would be affected, and so how would we be able to sustain readiness so we could avoid Task Force Smiths would be critical as we move forward. And then finally, it would significantly delay any modernization efforts we have that could fundamentally really keep us from providing what we believe is necessary to properly modernize the force.
Mr. Chairman, may I just add a few words? Chief's absolutely right. We're not doing, as yet, any hard planning. That would probably happen later in the summer, would it go to that extent. But just some back-of-the-envelope math can tell you if the Army receives an apportioned share amongst the services of that cut, it would be about 26%. I think that's probably best-case scenario for us. That's $134 billion through 17. To take that kind of additional cut through the FIDIP, as the Chief said, would leave virtually no activity the Army undertakes untouched. You mentioned contracts. The Army has open contracts totaling since 2000, 96,000 in number at the moment. Not all of those would be affected, but a great number of them would. In some cases, if we interrupt the program, we have to pay closeout costs on those contracts. I worry about, as I know you do, Mr. Chairman, what do the manufacturing interests? What do our industrial base interests do the further we get into the year? They have employees. They have to plan. Some have shareholders. The uncertainty, I think, is something that the sooner it can be cleared up, the better it will serve all.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Mr. Smith.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I share your concerns and these gentlemen's concern about sequestration. I think it is imperative that we avoid it for many of the reasons that have been stated. And I think the big problem with our budget approach, I mean, there's three basic pieces of trying to deal with the deficit here. There's the mandatory spending, there's the discretionary spending, and then there's the revenue, all of the money that comes in. You know, I mean, in all of those areas, we've seen spending go up significantly in both mandatory and discretionary, and we've seen revenue go down significantly in the last 10 years by over 30%, you know, in large part because of the sheer number of tax cuts that we've passed over the course of the last 10 years and then the ups and downs of the economy. All three of those pieces have to be on the table if we're going to seriously deal with this, and unfortunately, as the Chairman points out, the Budget Control Act only dealt with one, and then sort of on a wing and a prayer said, well, we hope the super committee will figure out the other two, which didn't happen. And I think the overall problem here is the depth of denial in this country, not just in this town, about where the deficit is at and what is going to be required to respond to it is unprecedented. What we do is, you know, every person or elected official has their area of the budget that they care about, and they will fight to the death to defend it. And then say, yeah, the deficit's a problem, but deal with it someplace else. You know, that's why we need a comprehensive approach that looks at revenue, mandatory spending, and discretionary. And yet, you know, it's really not happening. All we're really hearing is, you know, defend our portion of the budget. You know, we hear it on this committee. Defense is our thing. We defend it. You don't hear people saying, here's what we ought to cut from mandatory spending, or, well, other than me and a few others, here's what we ought to raise in taxes. I'm willing to raise those taxes to make sure we don't have to do the cuts necessary. And that's the key to this. You know, if we want to protect defense from sequestration or even from the size of the cuts that it's facing, then we have to put specific proposals on the table to either raise revenue or make cuts in mandatory spending. And until we do that, we're going to be vulnerable. You know, and we've got a bill coming up here in about a half hour that's going to add another $100-some-odd billion to the problem. So, you know, we're going in the wrong direction, and I share the Chairman's concerns about the impact that will have on defense. And it's our responsibility not just to complain about the cuts that are happening to defense, but to look at those other two pieces of the equation, the revenue and the mandatory spending, to make sure that discretionary spending is protected. That's our responsibility, not yours, and it's one that thus far we are failing to meet. And if we really want to protect defense, we'd better change that. I want to ask quickly about some of the sexual assault language that has been in previous legislation and your efforts within the Army to step up and deal with what is a fairly sizable problem and concerns about how sexual assault charges are handled. We have passed some legislation under the leadership of Ms. Davis, Ms. Sanchez, Ms. Songas, and others on this committee to try to better address that issue. There are some proposals to go further. I think the biggest proposal is the idea of taking sexual assault outside the normal chain of command in terms of charging. I know there are deep concerns within the military about that. So if you could do two things. One, tell us about the progress that's being made with some of the changes we've done, and then explain your concerns about going outside the chain of command for sexual assault cases. But the big thing is, to avoid that second one, we have to have some confidence that the first one is making a real difference.
And we deeply appreciate the leadership that many members on this committee have brought to the issue. And I just want to assure you, having worked on this matter as Personnel Subcommittee Chairman and Ranking Member in my time here, there are few things that are more in contrast to the basic Army values, and few things that happen within our ranks that we're more concerned about and that we're not trying every day to become better. As to our responses, as you know, Mr. Smith, we've taken a holistic approach to this from both the counseling, pre-counseling, encouraging victims to come forward to report, trying to provide them the assurances necessary both within their command and within the larger Army that they won't be victimized again, that coming forward and talking about these things will not be a career killer for them. But beyond that, what we're also trying to do is bring sensitivity to our youngest soldiers and bring responsibility to our NCO Corps and to our leaders. We've instituted constant training programs from the basic level training courses through the drill sergeant's course, through the basic officer leader course. We've instituted training programs into the JAG schools so that our Army attorneys understand the special way in which these matters need to be handled both socially as well as legally. We've tried to, in fact, have greatly increased the resourcing that's necessary to provide lab examiners. We've hired more of those to provide special investigators. We've hired 6 highly qualified experts in sexual assault and harassment to come in with our ranks to guide us both in terms of program development, but also to help our prosecutors and to help our investigators make sure that they're up to the latest developments that come about. We have mobile training teams that go out and go to every unit in the Army, conducting specialized training for our on-post camp and station investigators as well. I think if you look at the data, they're still too high and they're unacceptable, but we do have some glimmer of progress. Our report rate is 33%. I view that as abysmal, but in the civilian sector, the report rate is 18%. We refer some 60% of all cases of actual rape and assault brought to our officials for court-martial. And our conviction rates have gone as high as 78%. And not every one of those data points has a similar data point within the civilian sector, but we are doing better, and in some cases better than the civilian sector. But better is not good enough. We have to get this to a point where one instance is one too many, and that's our objective.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And it is worth noting that this is not just a problem in the military. And I hope we do understand that, General.
I would just like to add that, as I mentioned in my opening statement, there's institutional and operational capabilities that we have to establish, and the Secretary covered most of those. But the one thing I really want to focus on is the cultural and institutional issues we have here. We get soldiers from all different parts of society, all different parts of the country. It's important for us as we initially bring them in to ensure that we foster a climate of trust and respect that we expect within our own institution. And that will start early on. We now have courses when you go through basic training, whether you go to your first officer courses, whether you're in officer development training, and it's going to be inculcated in everything that we do, because that's how important it is. Our female population plays an incredible role in our Army, and we have to ensure that they have the environment that they can operate in properly, and so we take this very seriously. If I could just make a short comment about the Uniform Code of Military Justice, I think it's important that we work carefully about this. Uniform Code of Military Justice provides us incredible flexibility to operate across a wide range of sexual assault, sexual harassment initiatives that we do not want to lose. And so it's important that we continue to have discussions about this. And I'm adamant that with hard work, we will ensure that the chain of command is able to use the administrative and UCMJ authorities they have to help us to enforce this program.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Bartlett.
Thank you. Our chairman mentioned Task Force Smith. Regarding the lessons learned from Task Force Smith, one of the reasons why the Army couldn't get enough soldiers and equipment into the initial action was because there was a limited number of transport aircraft. I understand that the Air Force has decided to not procure any more C-27J aircraft and will be retiring some C-130s. I realize that you have recently signed a memorandum of understanding with the Air Force, but when it comes to providing support out to the last technical mile, are you convinced that the Air Force will be able to meet all of your needs? And if they don't, will the Army have to increase its use rates for other assets such as the CH-47 helicopter? I think everybody knows that the Air Force was never very enthusiastic about the C-27J. They didn't even want the plane. In a logic that I had some trouble understanding, the Pentagon assigned the plane to the Air Force and then asked them to be at the beck and call of the Army when the Army needed that support. I didn't think this was a prescription for a really effective military. And I understand now that because of limitations in airstrips in Afghanistan, that we don't have enough C-27Js, and one source said you're flying the blades off the 47 to meet the demand there. How sanguine are you that if we're involved in conflicts like Afghanistan in the future, that the Air Force is going to be able to meet your needs?
Thank you, sir. First, in terms of and you're touching on our intra-theater lift, in terms of strategic lift, we're confident in the C-5 Mikes and the C-17s that will be able to help us to move our forces strategically around the globe in order to meet our requirements. In terms of intra-theater lift, which is the subject you focused on, it is important that we have the capability to move in intra-theater. When I was the commander in Iraq, we'd conducted the test for the C-130 that was then attached to the Army in order to meet its missions, and we found it to be an incredibly successful program where we controlled where it went, we controlled the loads, and it enabled us to get what we needed in intra-theater lift where we needed it on time. And that's the basis of the memorandum of understanding that's been now signed between us and the Air Force based on the tests that we conducted in Iraq. Afghanistan, as you have said, has very difficult terrain. So it is a very specific case. And yes, we have had to fly a significant amount of CH-47 hours in Afghanistan in order to provide support to our desperate bases. But we've also done other things like airdrop. And we've significantly invested in our ability to more accurately airdrop supplies and other things to remote locations, which has helped us solve some of these issues. The C-27 has performed very well in Afghanistan. I visited them personally. They're at a high operational readiness rate. They have provided a capability that has been helpful in Afghanistan. I would just say that I think with the choices that have to be made, one of the choices the Air Force made was to reduce that capability. So what we're now trying to do is we'll continue to increase the use of the C-130 to support our intra-theater lift, as well as I pointed out, more precise airdrop capabilities. And we'll continue to work on that as we move forward.
Another area of considerable concern to me is lightening the load on the soldier. General, in your opinion, do we need to shift the balance in the operational requirements process from a higher priority on aircraft and vehicles to a more emphasis on soldier focus? As an example, how can we help you to speed up the rapid innovation process for weight reduction in initiatives for individual soldier systems? In 120-degree temperature, they're carrying 150 pounds now. That's just unacceptable, isn't it?
We have actually made, in my opinion, great progress in this area. And what we now look at is as a squad. It's about what the squad can carry together in a load. Now, what's happened is we've made some significant improvements in reducing the weight of what they were carrying, but now what we're doing is we're finding we're carrying more things. It gives them the capability to have more and provide more capability in the squad as it moves forward. So we have to now work through and understand what specifically we think a squad needs for it to be successful. Because as we've lightened the load, we've added more things to the squad. And so what we have to do is invest in deciding what are the absolute optimal loads that we have and continue to look at the technologies to reduce body armor. We've made some good progress there, but we still want to continue to look at decreasing the weight of our body armor while increasing the amount of protection as we move.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Reyes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, thank you for being here this morning. I know we've talked about the impact that these cutbacks can potentially have on the industrial base. I'm particularly concerned about the ground combat vehicle. This is a basic staple of the ability of the Army to fight. The current plan, according to the budget submitted, calls for a total shutdown of the Abrams, Bradley, and Stryker production lines for 3 to 4 years, which starts in FY14. I just want to get it on the record. How can the Army be sure that the production lines, and in particular the skilled workers, because in a recent visit to my colleague Mr. Kritz's district that both Chairman Bartlett and I went to, that is a very real concern on behalf of industry, that the skilled workers are not going to be there after such a lengthy shutdown. So after going cold for 3 to 4 years, how can we be sure that that capacity will be able to regenerate itself?
Well, it's a great question. It's one we're very concerned about and very focused on as well. What we have attempted to do at this point is really a two-prong approach. First of all, the Department of Defense is leading what's called the S2T2, the sector-by-sector, tier-by-tier analysis of all of our industrial partners to try to assess those greatest vulnerabilities, the kinds of things that you mentioned, Mr. Reyes, and to figure a path forward for all the services jointly as to how we might lessen that challenge and burden on the individual locations. Beyond that, the Army itself is doing an industrial baseline. Our folks in our acquisition community are looking at those things as, by way of example, you mentioned the Abrams shutdown in Ohio. What we're doing with GLDS or GDLS, General Dynamics Land Systems, the contractor on site, is trying to ensure that through particularly their FMS sales, their foreign military sales, which they are beginning to line up, in which the Department of Defense is attempting to assist them, provides that core ability for those particularly highly skilled engineer positions to retain employment until we begin our recapitalization program in 2017 of the M1A2 SEPV Abrams. So this is something that is of great interest. It's something, as I said, we're looking at very hard, and there are no guarantees, but whether it's PPPs, public-private partnerships, or other kinds of approaches, as far as we're concerned, we're willing to pursue any reasonable path to ensure that those particularly critical jobs remain viable.
And I'm sure you've given it thought, but is there any way to keep some kind of a minimum production capacity for the Army during these?
Well, every facility has a minimum sustain rate. For the Abrams, I believe it's 70 tanks a year, which is far beyond our, not just our fiscal ability, it's far beyond our need. But as those minimum sustain rates are figured through, we try to, as I say, meet them through other means, public-private partnerships, FMS, and any other way by which we can assist. So those are part of the calculation.
And
I would just add that we are being aggressive with our foreign military sales programs and identifying potential suitors who need this type of equipment, and so we think there's some potential there, and that's something we'll continue to work very hard just to add to what the Secretary said. But for example, in Lima, it would cost us $2.8 billion to keep that open, and our tank fleet is in good shape. We don't need to, because of the great support we've gotten over the last few years, and we're not going to need to start recap or reset on that till 17. So we have to fill that gap between the end of 14 and 17, and we'll try to use FMS where we can to do this.
Very good. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Mr. Forbes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, it's an honor to have both of you here today. We appreciate your service, and as you know, we're often here a very bipartisan committee, and I agree very much with the distinguished ranking member when he indicates that we simply as a Congress can't spend $800 billion on a stimulus package, almost twice the cuts we're now placing in defense, or pass a massive health care act without having consequences. Two of those consequences are that we either have to ask hardworking taxpayers in America to spend more of their money to help cover our spending problem, or we have to cut the defense of the nation that they love, and neither of those consequences are good. If we could consider all of that in here, then the sign outside would say House of Representatives, but it doesn't. It says House Committee on Armed Services. So I'm going to focus on our military concerns. And General, specifically for you, you've been working, I know, to articulate the role the Army can play in our Asia-Pacific defense plans. And when it comes to maintaining operational access in a theater where the threat of ballistic missiles is growing, it would seem to me the Army could play a larger role in providing theater missile defense to our forward deployed personnel and facilities and provide a means of alleviating some of the missile defense burden on the Navy. However, in the FY13 budget, there are cuts to the THAAD program and the Patriot programs, and I'm concerned about the Army in-strength reductions and how they could affect this mission. Could you just tell us and discuss maybe a little bit the role the Army foresees for itself in providing theater missile defense in the Asia-Pacific region, and then the Secretary might add something to that if he would.
Thank you, Congressman. First, we do play a significant role in the Pacific Region Air and Missile Defense Command. We have our major command is in Hawaii, who manages air and missile defense for the region. We have Patriot battalions forward deployed in the Asia-Pacific region. And we have tactical operational strategic radars that are being deployed into the region to continue to supplement the current air and missile defense capabilities that we have. We are very focused on forward air and missile defense capability in our key theaters, both Asia-Pacific and other areas, to include the Middle East. And we will continue to do and fund that. And we have the capability to do that. We have the force structure to do that. So I feel confident that we'll continue to be involved with that. I'd also say there's many other roles that the Army can play in anti-access capabilities as we look at ground opportunities for entry and other things. And our ability, because of the large influence that the armies have in the Pacific region, we can help to develop systems and capabilities, multilateral systems and capabilities that would help us in our anti-access campaign. And so I think in the joint operational access capability assessment that the Joint Staff is doing, the Army will play a significant role in this as we move forward to build on the capabilities of the Navy and Air Force. And I think it's that joint concept and joint operational concept that will help us to have and work the anti-access capabilities.
Mr. Secretary?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Forbes. I think the Chief laid down very well our current posture there. I would just say from a budgetary perspective, while your observation is absolutely right, there are cuts in the funding line to the entire program. All of the accounts in the Asia-Pacific region for Army were protected. We haven't diminished any of those. I get a little red behind the ears when I hear so many people, you did not, but I hear so many people refer to the Asia-Pacific region as strictly naval and air. There's a lot of air there and there's a lot of water there, but there's a heck of a lot of people there as well. And the fact of the matter is the Army has long been a dominant posture in the Pacific, over 76,000 troops. We had 120 plus activities and other kinds of operations with our Pacific Asia partners. We're looking to grow those. The Chief just got back from visits to Japan and Korea. And as we develop jointly into our new strategy, again, as the Chief suggested, the Army has expertise in those missile defense platforms, and if we can fulfill an expanded role of that mission, that'd be something we'd want to pursue very anxiously.
Well, we want to thank you both for your service, but also for the great men and women that you constantly turn out that serve our country. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary in General, for being here and for your service. I wanted to go back to the sexual assault question for a second because I don't know if you had as much time, General, to respond to the chain of command issue, and perhaps Mr. McHugh, you'd like to weigh in as well. As you know, there are a lot of victims and people who are concerned that the chain of command has not allowed victims to have the kind of access to help that perhaps they have needed, particularly in the past, but even today. Could you comment on that a little bit more and why you feel that it does serve best? I would say for myself, I think this is a leadership issue. And so I think it's very important that leadership take responsibility and accountability. But on the other hand, we know that there are quite a number of instances when that has not worked.
Yeah, thank you. And I don't disagree with your statement. It absolutely is a leadership issue. It's a commander's issue, as we would call it. And it's something that we have to continue to work. And again, it's even with our, it's about continued education. It's about making sure that we have a message that goes through the chain of command that this is something that's incredibly important to the welfare of the Army, the welfare of our profession, and we'll continue to do that. What I have found over my years of experience with these types of issues is, first off, you have to have a couple things. You have to have the ability for victims to, some victims do not, it's about the victims feeling comfortable how they report and who they report to. So you got to have a variety of ways for them to report. And that's why it's important that we continue to have them, if they want to, not use the chain of command to report and report outside of the chain of command. And we have established, and we'll continue to emphasize that if that's what they feel comfortable doing. But it's also important for us to ensure that to the chain of command that this is an important issue for morale. It's an important issue for our ability to execute our mission on a day-to-day basis. And it's also important for them to understand and help train them on what's available in the Uniform Code of Military Justice and other means in order to hold people accountable. And that, in fact, as we do in everything we do, we will hold our commanders accountable for the discipline and morale of their units. And it's important that they will understand this as we go forward. So what we've done is we're increasing emphasis within our Judge Advocate General Corps to help train our commanders to ensure they understand what they can and what they can do. And also, it's important for us working through the chain of command to emphasize the importance of this. We talk to every battalion and brigade commander at Fort Leavenworth. They come through there every month for a pre-command course. We have added a portion specifically dedicated to this subject so they understand the importance of this. And in fact, the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army with a group is headed out there next week to talk about a variety of subjects, this being one of the main subjects that we talk about. And so I think it's things like that will help us to emphasize in the chain of command their responsibilities. The other thing is to make sure that we have enough oversight where we disconnect a bit, be able to look at it from a little higher level from the chain of command. In other words, people who are not so close to the incident, and they can make, and we have ways to do that, and we're working as well as using that as a technique as well. So, again, we're focused on this, ma'am.
I want to thank this committee and this Congress because I think you passed some very important legislation in the last session that set some requirements as to sexual assaults for response coordinators, SARCs, and victims advocates. And the Army had already started on that, but you raised the bar as to a requirement that they be the SARCs be at the brigade level and victims advocates. We have 2 VAs at every battalion level and company level, and that provides the kind of alternative that the chief had just spoken about. If a victim feels uncomfortable going to their chain of command. But that really, as you noted, Mrs. Davis, that's the critical part of fixing this more fully, making those commanders sensitive, making them understand that if they don't get it right, they're not going to be in this Army much longer. Yeah. As to the UCMJ, it provides the prosecutors the opportunity to take action against people who are perhaps not violent sexual offenders, but inappropriate touching. The kinds of actions that probably in the civilian sector, nothing is done. And we take action against them as well, whether it's an Article 15 or holding off a promotion or pay cuts.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. My time is about up. I did want to make one comment if the chairman would let me. I think one of the things that I've heard is that if women are serving up and down the commands and across the spectrum of the services, then in many ways we'll have less of this. So I just wanted to share my somewhat disappointment, I think, with the latest report that came out in Women in Combat, and hope that we can work together to make sure that there's a process in place to be able to really determine the physical standards that are needed and how we're going to get to that, particularly for women who want to serve in those commands.
Thank you,
sir.
Mr. Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you both for being here. As an Army veteran, I'm particularly happy to see the venue today. Additionally, I am very grateful to represent Fort Jackson. I soon will be having a geographic presence adjacent to Fort Gordon, and so it's really exciting. And then I've got 3 sons serving the Army National Guard, and so I appreciate your service. And Mr. Secretary, I'm very grateful to be seated in the John McHugh seat, chair, and so it's a great honor to follow you in supporting military personnel. So thank you so much for your service. And General Odierno, one of the highlights of my congressional service, we knew of your success in Iraq. But when we came to be briefed and you came up with a diagram, what appeared to be the state of Virginia, and you explained that this indicates a high level of violence where Northern Virginia would be the height, but then the surge, and then it led to the eastern shore, and so it was a diagram that could be understood by anyone, and so your success is just greatly appreciated by me. With that, though, I'm really concerned about the administration's budget, and in particular, Mr. Secretary, the extraordinary fee increases in regard to TRICARE. We have commitments to our service members, our veterans, and the service that our young people make is just extraordinary, and their families. And sadly, the administration is proposing a TRICARE fee increase, FY13, 30 to 78%, and then over the next 5 years, from 94% to 345%. To me, this is a great concern for the people I represent, and in fact, I'm very concerned, and I would like to know how you feel this will affect recruiting, retention, and then what message does this send to our young people who are in the field today?
Well, I think you have to remember, as to recruiting and retention, none of these increases would affect those who are currently serving. So the increases would only be affected on those retirees under the age of 65 who are out of the military, obviously, and working by and large. This was not an easy decision, but it is something that this committee has talked about for a good number of years, and it is simply the fact that the healthcare system within the military services, just as it is within the civilian sector, from a price perspective, is out of control. While the percentage of these increases over time in some of the categories sound to be quite large, the fact of the matter is, A, these are the first increases since the program was put into place in the mid-1990s, and B, from a comparative perspective, as in relation to the civilian community, the TRICARE program will still be very, very beneficial and in most cases, a far more generous program than you can find in the private sector. So the interest here, and it's shared amongst the NCOs, senior NCOs, amongst all the service chiefs and all the service secretaries, is that we have to do something now to ensure that this program remains viable for those great men and women in uniform and their families who have served. And the reality is, the longer we wait, as in so many of the other problems that this Congress is attempting to deal with, the answer gets harder and harder, and the increases will get larger and larger. So we think the time to act is now, maintaining a highly generous program, and certainly those great men and women in uniform have earned it.
And TRICARE is so appreciated. A concern I have is hollowing out of the military. First of all, I want to thank you both for your courage in regard to speaking out in regard to sequestration. There are different definitions of hollowing out. My concern is for senior NCOs and junior officers who have combat experience. This is invaluable. How are we going to address this? Is there a preference? Is there a protection? What will we be doing to maintain people with combat experience?
Well, first off, that's why for me, as we come down in size, it's about the length of the ramp over 5 years. That's what's so key to that. Because if we can do it over a 5-year period, as we have asked for, that enables us to keep the best, to ensure we keep the combat tested, the combat experienced officers and non-commissioned officers we have. If we're asked to do it more quickly than that, then we will lose many of our combat tested and non-commissioned leaders, both officer and non-commissioned officer. So that's why this 5-year period is so important for us as we look at drawing down the Army.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Mr. Loebsack.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks to both of you for your service. As I've discussed with both of you many times in the past, in various venues, as you'll recall, I strongly believe that a key to the reversibility that is built into defense strategy and a key to ensuring that our country is able to rapidly equip our soldiers in the event of future contingencies is our organic industrial base. I'm very pleased that Congressman Schilling and I were able to expand the ability of our arsenals to enter into public-private partnerships through last year's NDAA. And I believe that those partnerships, as does Congressman Schilling, will be key to maintaining the readiness for our arsenals. However, I also believe the Army must do its part, and I do believe that the Army must actively support the readiness of our organic industrial base. And specifically, my question then regarding this particular issue is, what is the Army's plan to workload the organic industrial base, including our organic manufacturing base through the arsenals, to ensure really that its capabilities are maintained in order to respond in case we do have another OCO at some point down the road? And if there is a plan, how will it be implemented to ensure that these critical capabilities are maintained?
Thank you for your concerns on a very important area. Generally, when people talk about so-called reversibility, I think they perhaps naturally think about reversing our end strength numbers. That's something we spent a lot of time on, and I think one of the more important components of the way in which the Army has shaped itself through this budget is we retain those NCO, senior NCO positions, and particularly field grade officers who would be so critical to expanding our numbers. But there's another component to that reversibility as well, as you noted, sir, and that is our ability to produce the products, the weapons, the platforms that are necessary to when we send our warfighters out to do the hard work of freedom. I mentioned earlier one of the critical components of how we're going forward right now are the various analyses that both the Department of Defense and the Army are conducting, sector by sector, tier by tier analysis through DoD, and an Army baseline industrial capability analysis, trying to both identify where our major risk lies, where the single point of failures exist, and also to try to establish a strategy where we can do as much as we possibly can, whether it's through PPPs, as Rock Island, I think, has done very, very effectively, or through increased FMS to keep those work lines busy and open. This is going to be a very difficult challenge. These are in large measure highly skilled workers, and that's certainly true at Rock Island. I've had the pleasure of visiting there. We have a similar hard metal facility at Watervliet and Albany, and those two do some pretty important things. So this is an ongoing effort, and we recognize it. And frankly, if all of our locations were as aggressive and forward-leaning as Rock Island has been to go out and to develop partnerships, we'd be a little less challenged. So I appreciate yours and Senator Durbin's and the entire delegation's vigilance on that matter.
Thank you. General?
If I could, Congressman, as you've stated, the organic industrial base is key to our ability to continue to be capable of not only reversibility but to sustain the force as we move forward. It has been for the last several years. What we've done is we've developed core functions at many of these areas which will enable us to sustain what we need, enabling these core functions. We will have to continue to assess as we look at our budgets in the future to see, do we have to redesignate some core functions or combine some, but I'm confident that we have a good program in place to take advantage of these core functions that we've established at many of these arsenals, depots, et cetera. As you know, there will be some reduced, for the next few years I think we'll sustain a fairly high rate, but as we move forward and we continue to finish the reset coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we'll have to start to reduce some of the capacity, but we will try to keep the expertise necessary to sustain these core functions that we'll need over the long haul.
And I think from a national security standpoint, I think we can all agree, too, that should we have another overseas contingency operation at some point, we don't want to be in a situation where it takes some time to ramp up the production of whatever it is that the arsenals or whatever are actually producing at that time. As was already mentioned, make sure that we do provide for our troops when they go overseas in whatever mission it may be that they're trying to perform. And I do have one question for the record I'd like to submit having to do with our reserve components as well, if I may do that as well. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The vote has been called. I plan on trying to get in 2 more questioners before, and then we'll recess and come back as soon as we can. Mr. Loviando.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary General, thank you very much for being here and for your service. Mr. Secretary, I have a 2-part question for you. I see that in this year's budget, you've submitted a request for approval to enter into a second multi-year contract for the CH-47 Chinook helicopter. Since you've been using the multi-year for Chinooks for the past 5 years, and I understand that one will expire this year, what have you seen as the biggest benefit for you and the taxpayer of having the authority that has led you to request a second multi-year contract? And the second part of it, Mr. Secretary, is the Armed Aerial Scout Program an Army priority?
As the CH-47, we found that multi-year contract to be very efficient. We're very, very pleased with the product and the product line. And as we have looked hard at our acquisition strategies, both successes and failures over the last several years, the CH-47 contract as it is currently configured seems to have embodied a lot of the answers and a lot of the solutions to some of our challenges. So we thought it was in the best interest, both in terms of the production line, but most importantly for the taxpayer and for the Army to extend that contract. And I'm hoping that that comes through to fruition. The Armed Aerial Scout is still a priority for us. We're looking at an analysis of our way forward. As you know, for now we're dealing with the Chinooks and the CASUP program, the cockpit upgrade program, as a bridge to that. And the Chinook will be a part of our inventory probably till at least 2025. But we still believe we need an Armed Aerial Scout program, and we're pursuing it as an important priority. Chief.
If I could just add to the last piece, the Armed Aerial Scout is important for us. It's an important capability that we have to sustain. And as Secretary said, we're doing an analysis of alternatives that will be done in 13. And once we do that, we'll have to make a decision whether we go to a new aircraft or do we continue then to keep the Kiowa Warrior and upgrade the Kiowa Warrior. And that'll be a decision that is made next year. And right now we expect to have the Kiowa, as the Secretary just said, the Kiowa Warrior through 2025. So this is an incredibly important program. We'll look at the analysis of these alternatives that we have next year, and then we'll decide on how we want to move forward.
Yeah, I said Kiowa Warrior, or I said Chinook, obviously Kiowa Warrior. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary and General. Thank you, General. Can you tell us what you believe the status and readiness of the Army's current inventory of pre-positioned equipment is?
I feel very confident with it. In fact, we've just actually issued our pre-deployment equipment in Kuwait to the brigade that moved that there from Iraq, and they've been exercising with it, and it was in very good condition. It's important for us to sustain our pre-positioned fleet in very good condition. Now, we are going to continue to review this. As we now look at this change in strategy, we'll look at, do we have to make some minor adjustments in pre-positioned fleets? And where are they in the right place? Do we need some training pre-positioned stocks to do multilateral training in the Pacific, to do rotational training in Europe? And we'll take a look at that. And as we're downsizing, we have an opportunity here to use some of the equipment that were in some of our forces potentially to use in these pre-positioned sites. So that'll be a continued analysis that we conduct. It's a very important program, and it's going to become more important as we move to the future.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Kissel.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary and General. Thank you all for being here today. Obviously, time is an issue right now. I was wanting to hear a little bit more about the importance of a ramp down in attrition, but I think, General, you mentioned that that 5-year plan is so important to what we're doing to be able to keep the best of the best. Also wanted to talk more about equipment and not, I know in one of our readiness hearings a while back, we were discussing about where do we go with equipment, how tied down are we to equipment we might have as versus what we think we might need in some of the future challenges we have. So the two questions I want to zero in on. I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time next week with a lot of our reserve and guard components in North Carolina. Just do y'all anticipate the role of the guard reserve being, and how we're going to balance that out towards where the challenges we have?
I'll take that first. So in terms of the guard and reserve first, the lessons we've learned here is that we have to have a total Army. We have to have certain capabilities in the active component, but we have to have ready capabilities in the reserve component for us to be successful as an Army, especially as we continue to downsize. So what we want to do is take advantage of the experience that we've gained in our active reserve component as they've been a significant part of our deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. So what we're going to do is we're going to set up a progressive readiness model that will enable us to attempt to sustain key components of the reserve component and continue to sustain an operational reserve. It won't obviously be as big as it is now because of the requirements in Iraq and Afghanistan, but what we'll do is rotate units through and provide them more dollars in order to sustain a readiness level that will enable them to continue to contribute on a rotational basis operationally. And I think in the long term, that will help us to sustain a higher readiness rate within the reserve component. So we're very focused on that.
If I could add, Mr. Kissel, we worked very hard over recent years to try to upgrade the level of equipment within the reserve component, both the reserve and the guard, and I think the data points suggest we've come a long ways. For example, the equipment on hand ratings right now for the active component is 87%. The National Guard is also 87%, and the reserve is 86%. And based on this budget and the FIDIP in which it lies, we hope to grow the AC to 94%, the Guard to 92%, and the reserve to 90% by just the end of 13. So the challenge, as the Chief noted, going forward is make sure we maintain that level, both in the readiness side and the equipment part of that rating, and also, of course, the personnel. And how we do that is something that I want to give a tip of the hat to the Chief and to the leadership of both the Guard and Reserve components are working together to make sure we have a readiness model that works and everybody agrees upon.
Thank you, gentlemen. And one quick question, research and development. Do you feel comfortable that we have enough monies allocated for that to keep us ahead of the fight in all situations?
Well, as Mr. Smith said, would I take more money? And the answer is sure. But within this budget construct that I think we all agree is achievable and is viable, the R&D, I think, line is sufficient to keep us where we need to be.
Okay. Thank you, sir. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. At this point, we will recess, and maybe they'll just have one vote. Anyway, we're going to expedite, and hopefully the recess will be as short as we can make it. Thank you.
So what we don't have is a force that could do long-term stability operations over a long period of time. So if that occurs, we're going to have to relook growing the force again. But we'll use the reserve component as a buffer in order to have them help us to give us the time to grow the force if we get engaged in another major theater of war.
Great. And I do hope that y'all vigorously pursue the FMS, because I think that is a great way for us to keep some of these lines hot. Thank you very much. My time's expired.
Thank you. Mr. Conaway.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and gentlemen, thanks for being here today. Appreciate that. I want to just make a kind of a gratuitous comment. I appreciate the continued commitment to the WIN-T program, the JITRS communications program, because I do think those are important to leaner and more agile and all those kind of adjectives that we throw at it. But those are the tools, I think, that allow you to go that. Following up on Mr. Rogers' comments, and perhaps, page 7 of your summary listing Army components, you list the reserve component as one unit. And maybe today or soon we can start that arduous conversation about why we have a reserve and a guard. Not today, but it may make sense given the look at it. I was here in 2005 and watched some of the struggles of converting the Guard and Reserve from a strategic force with a domestic mission to a tactical force that was used extensively. To today, downrange, you can't tell this unless you know the patches and understand the org chart. You can't tell the difference between a Guard unit and an active duty unit. So, General, over the next 5 to 10 years, will you have in place the right readiness matrix to make sure that Guard Reserve component stays ready for the fight? And how will you look at rotating the, for lack of a better phrase, quick reaction force? Because if you do that extended deal, somebody's got to be first. And how do you keep those guys ready, and how do you rotate that readiness issue through that system in order to make sure that we don't have those growing pains we experienced in the original conversion?
As we went through it, I think, as most of you are aware, as we went through this process, continue to meet our commitments in Iraq and Afghanistan, we developed what we call Army Force Generation Model, which put both active and reserve component units, National Guard, Army Reserve, active, through a sequence of preparing themselves to get mobilized, to get ready, and then to deploy. As we come out of Iraq and Afghanistan, we are going to adjust that process. We're not going to walk away from it. We're going to adjust it. And we're going to keep a process where active and reserve component units will be in a reset phase, a training phase, and an available phase. We're still working on the Pacific.
When you said reserve, that include reserve? That's the
National Guard and U.S. Army Reserves. And what we will do is, for an active unit, for example, a cycle would be 24 months. And they spend 6 months in reset, 10 months in training, 12 months available, whatever times. And then for the reserve component, it would be a bit expanded because maybe over a 60-month period, but allow them to rotate through. So we'd always have a portion of the National Guard and U.S. Army Reserves ready to go. And what it also does is it will enable sustained readiness across the force over a long period of time. So that's the intent of our process. We're working through the details of this and how it's funded and how we sustain them over time. And I think we're going to be able to do this. We're working very closely with both mainly the National Guard, but also the U.S. Army Reserve on this concept.
With the readiness reporting program that you have morph into something that will be able to show us, this side of the table, where we are at any one point in time with respect to those.
It's going to have to, and it's going to have to do it for the total Army.
Right, right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Hunter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your service, and General Odierno for your service and for your family's sacrifice as well as your own. There's one thing that both of you mentioned, is the JLTV. Want to run through a few things. The new requirements don't require blast or underbody protection to the same stringent requirements that they were originally stated. First question is, why relax the requirements? I'm going to keep going if you don't mind. Why did we relax the requirements? Why did we relax the weight limit? If you go over 13,000 pounds, as you know, it makes you less mobile, whether it's air mobile or if you're putting them on, if you're putting these, because the Marine Corps is going to use them too. They're going to be on ships. They're going to be heavier on the ships as well. From what I could see from all of the different people, all the different vendors that are applying for this, their vehicles come in around 13 to 16,000 pounds or more when you add their armor kit on, which makes them, you can't carry them, in fact, in a CH-46. My specific question is about Ford Motor Company. My district's in San Diego. Ford is not there. I have no dog in this fight, no horse in this race. Ford has offered to build the next Humvee. They've offered to spend $400 million of their own money to do it. They've offered to come in with multiple prototypes to give you, to say, here's what we have. This is the second largest car manufacturer in the nation, a manufacturer that goes back, if you go back to World War II in Korea, making American products for American military personnel. Let me run through a few things on Ford. They can come out at $225,000 per vehicle, and what's more important, Ford's estimates, because they make cars and trucks for a living, their estimates now, their original estimates, will be within 4% of their actual production cost. So there's not going to, as we look at all these different programs, we all know it's pretty hard to get it within that 4%. Ford can do that. What they tell you now will be what the vehicle costs in the future. They could save us over $100 billion, taxpayers, Congress, and the Army and Marine Corps, over life cycle costs and production costs over the life of this vehicle. The most troubling aspect of this is this. This is a quote from DOD talking about why the procurement date for this is set up for this June. The main question is Ford asked for an extra 12 months so they can compete for this. They were turned down by DOD. DOD said no. And here's what they told Ford. Ford, they could come in with more armor at less weight and provide more bang for the buck, basically. They said in source selection, no credit will be given for proposed performance above the threshold or at objective levels. What that translates to is if you make something that is clearly superior in protection, maneuverability, and weight, we don't really care. We're going to do this anyway. The only reason that DOD says to exclude Ford that I've seen from all the documents that I've read on this is that the money may be taken out of the budget by Congress. I think the Senate tried to kill this last year. It was a fight. The money was put in there anyway. So the only reason we're doing this now, this year, even though the vehicles won't be fielded until we're out of Afghanistan, is because the money may be taken out of the budget. I'm not getting this at all in this climate with what's going on. We're going to be out of Afghanistan. We're going to need to be more maneuverable. I don't see how we make a Humvee in the future that doesn't have underbody protection and that can't come in under 13,000 pounds, which Ford says they can, and theirs is called the Joint Marine Army Vehicle, the JMAV or something. They say they can do all these things, and all they're asking is for 12 months so they can compete. That's it. I mean, I guarantee you, if you look at what was more people in this room, if you told them to just give us 12 more months and we'll give you something that costs a lot less and provides more bang for your buck, we can almost guarantee it because, for God's sake, it's Ford. Ford. And I don't drive a Ford, by the way. So my dog's even more out of this fight. I drive a Chevy. I don't understand. And I guess I'm just asking for some clarification, explanation, or why can't we just work together on this and get it right this time and show how you can be a shining example for the rest of DOD and the military procurement system and say, here's how we did it.
As you know, Congressman Hunter, the program and whatever changes made to the requirements came about as a result of the discussions between the Marine Corps and the Army. There was a back and forth as to levels of protection, weight trade-offs, et cetera, and I'd certainly defer to the Chief as to some of the specifics on that. I do drive a Ford. It's a great company and has done amazing things in difficult times. And frankly, when this RFP first hit the street, I was very hopeful that they would choose to participate and to go ahead with the program. They chose not to. That was a disappointment to us. But we had set the ground rules. We had put out the RFPs. Every competitor, and we have, I believe, 6 companies now that are all very credible and have played by the rules that were set out. And from a general acquisition perspective, I think, and I can't speak for DOD, it would be a very tenuous decision to pull back an RFP based on a single manufacturer saying what they may or may not be able to do when they chose not to compete. Now, Ford can submit at any time during the process an unsolicited program that we'll fully consider. But we can't pull plugs on developmental programs where everybody else is playing by the same rules because a single competitor, as great as Ford is, says, here's what we promise you we're going to do. It's just, I think, would be a bad precedent to set, and that was part of our problem. I'm not even sure, frankly, it would be legal. I don't know if the Chief would want to add.
I don't think we're going to resolve this today. Let's call this kind of an opening gambit. Mr. Kaufman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for your service, General Odierno, Secretary McHugh. I'm concerned about, I agree with you in the bottom line cuts. I believe the cuts can be made to the Department of Defense. I don't believe that, I believe the sequester goes way overboard. I don't think there's any disagreement in that, in this committee on either side. But let me just express to you some areas that I think that I would like you to look at, because I'm concerned that we're cutting capability, and by cutting capability, we're increasing risk to our national security. One is I just think that there's a top-heavy nature to our military across the board. I think if we look at the ratio of flag officers or general officers to the number of soldiers, and this is in every branch of service, I believe, that it's just we're too top-heavy, and we really need to look at slimming that down. Next, I know there's talk about that we ought to slow down pay increases moving forward as a cost savings measure. I disagree with that, and let me give you another area that I would like you to look at, and that is slowing our promotion system down. I think that, first of all, I think it moves too fast. I think that we would increase not only have a cost savings, but increase the professionalism of our military by slowing down the promotion system, allowing soldiers to spend more time in grade in their respective military occupation and specialties before they move on. When you have an organization that has the kind of quality that the United States Army has today, which is extraordinary, and you have the kind of retention with highly qualified soldiers wanting to remain in the Army, it only makes sense that we do the math and we slow down the promotion system. Next, I think Guard and Reserve. I'm very disappointed that we have cuts in the Guard and Reserve that envisioned in your plan, where I think what we ought to be doing is increasing the size of the Guard and Reserve, quite frankly, through reductions on the active side. I mean, Secretary of Defense Gates, before he left, warned this committee repeatedly of the trajectory of personnel costs and how it was then eating into acquisition costs, irrespective of the cuts that are before us now. And so, to me, we can retain capability and do savings by looking at our force structure and more aggressively transferring units to the Guard and Reserve that we don't need, say, expeditionary forces or forces that truly need to be on active duty. Next, I'm concerned about, we're going to go through a BRAC round, a Base Realignment and Closure Commission, at the same time that we're still retaining permanent bases overseas without adequate participation of our allies. In NATO, most of our NATO partners are spending less than 2% on GDP on defense. We're at about 4.7% right now. Yet we have 45,000 troops in Germany, 79,000 troops, I think, in Europe altogether. We are moving 2 brigade combat teams, heavy brigade combat teams, I understand, out of Germany, out of that 45,000. But I think we ought to look at, if they're not involved in the prepositioning of forces, if they're not expeditionary in nature, they ought to come out of Europe. We can demonstrate our capability by doing some of the things you mentioned, having rotational forces, and certainly doing joint military exercises demonstrates our commitment to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. In South Korea, you mentioned 20,000 soldiers in South Korea. There are substantial, and this is obviously DoD, military construction programs going on. I believe it might be suspended. Some of it might be suspended in terms of looking at bringing dependents over. But at a time when South Korea is spending 2.7% of their GDP, so we're looking at closing bases down in the United States and yet retaining overseas permanent military bases for allies that are spending much less on defense than we are. We need to get them to do more. And so let me leave it open to you on those points. But I'm disappointed in the direction of these cuts, and I think they compromise capability where I don't think we need to.
First of all, now I'll try to go as quickly as I can. Sure. We agree with you on general officers, and in fact, that was an initiative that Secretary Gates had already begun. General Odierno could speak very eloquently as of the closing down of a COCOM and JIFCOM and an elimination of a 4-star. We downgraded the number, the 4-star to a 3-star U.S. Army Europe, and on and on and on. Pay increases.
I'd love to see what ratio you would come up with between flag officers and soldiers at the end of that. And I'm sorry that we're out of time, Mr. Chairman. If you could get to me on the record on any of these questions, I really appreciate it.
Mr. West.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Ranking Member, and also I want to thank the panel, Secretary McHugh, and I'd like to publicly recognize General Odierno and thank you for the privilege and honor of serving as a battalion commander under your command in 4th Infantry Division, and also to my brother Redleg sitting back there, Colonel Thompson. It's good to see you again. Questions I have, you know, we've been down this road before. Mr. Wilson talked about Task Force Smith. But when I look in the decrease of the combat brigade formations that we're having, can you talk to us about the ramifications you see as far as the combat tours of duty? Because I really believe some of the second and third order effects we see with some of these social issues that we had just talked about relates to the amount of tours that our young men and women are having to serve in these combat zones of operation. So have we looked at the ramifications of what could happen with maybe increased tours in combat zones?
Congressman, thank you very much. In terms of, we've looked very carefully at this as we've decided where to take force structure out. Because we're now out of Iraq, it has made a significant difference in the op tempo of our combat forces. And now that we're starting to reduce our presence in Afghanistan, that's also impacted that. So we feel that as we grew the Army in the mid-2000s to meet those requirements, now that they're going away, we now have the right force structure to be asked to do what we currently are doing. As I said earlier, where we might incur some risk is if we got involved in two major theaters that were extended over a long period of time. Mm-hmm. If for initial combat operations we have more than enough capability, we will have the competence to conduct those operations. So I feel comfortable with that. If they get extended again, that's where we run into some risk of the things you talked about, increased op tempo on our soldiers, and all the other things that go along with this that we're dealing with today. So we're very cognizant of that, and that's why it's important to build some reversibility into what we're doing so we can, if necessary, increase immediately the size of the Army. And one of the things we'll do is we're going to maintain officers and non-commissioned officers in our institutional Army. We've migrated them out over time, so we have more in the training base. We have more, so if we have to expand, we're able to keep the expertise and then use them to help us expand if necessary as we move forward.
Second question, we had a briefing earlier this week about operations in Afghanistan, and one of the things that I think is a very key lesson learned we finally got to was the VSO program, the Village Stability Operations Program. And of course, right now they're looking to expand that VSO program. So when I look at the fact that we're talking about putting more responsibility and burden on our special operations, you know, are our special operations forces in the United States Army going to be capable of expanding and extending the VSO operations in Afghanistan? As well, do we see possibly our conventional forces having to augment the VSO programs?
Thank you, Congressman. We are, in fact, continuing to increase our special operations forces throughout this budget. We'll go up to 35,000 special operations forces. We've increased in every area. We've increased Rangers. We've increased special forces battalions, the numbers, the companies involved. We're increasing their logistics capability. But as we're increasing VSO operations, we are also building on the relationships that have been built between the Special Operations and Conventional Army. And as we do that, in fact, you're going to see conventional forces pick up a piece of this mission. And in fact, you'll see that in this year, that we're using conventional capabilities to help with these VSO operations. And I think it's important. We've learned that we can do that, and it's a good partnership in order to best utilize our Special Operations Force in conjunction with the capabilities of our conventional forces to support them in these key operations. And I think you'll see more of that as we move forward in Afghanistan.
And last point, being from down in South Florida, I will tell you that I'm quite concerned about the Southcom AOR. You know, the fact that Ahmadinejad was visiting Cuba, and we have Hezbollah training camps down in South America in the tri-state area. So I would hope that we don't forget that, and you know, we can't continue to see it as an economy of force operation because that's pretty near and dear to us. And I believe that the enemy is seeing that we are not portraying a very strong presence down in the Southcom AOR. So with that being said, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gibson.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman and gentlemen, for being here today, for your leadership, commitment to our troopers, families, and veterans. And let me just say from the outset that I'm generally supportive of what you're doing here in the budget, particularly some of the major pieces of it. Notable exception, I associate myself with Mr. Kaufman, a lot of his remarks with regard to positioning of our forces. But what I'd like to explore here in the next few minutes is the nesting of operational concepts. Interested to know to what degree we use modeling and simulation as we went through the strategic review, and particularly here at the joint operational concept that drives the Army operational concept, because so much of this leads to requirements and then need for structure and procurement, leader development, everything in that regard. Last time the Army operational concept was published in 2009, very aware of how all the ins and outs to make that happen. Certainly have no expectation that there's a new document on the street. But in your notes that you took as you went through the process of the strategic review, if you could share with me the notable points with regard to the 09 document that you think may need to be readdressed in the current process of operational concept, and then other deductions and risks that you see in the force in relation to what we think we're going to need.
As we've looked ahead, first it's about looking at the last 10 years' war, but also trying to project at what we think we'll see in the future. And under the operational concept document, one of the key things is what we see the threat will be in the future and how we must respond to that threat. And it's the concept of the hybrid threat. It's the concept of the fact that we'll face an adversary that has a combination of conventional, unconventional, regular terrorist activities, criminality, and that we have a force that's being developed that can meet that spectrum of conflict. And, oh, by the way, different pieces of it from the lowest end combined all the way up to the highest end. And that we don't believe we'll ever see a straight conventional conflict again in the future. That's one of the key pieces that we're using as we move forward. And if you have a chance to go out to our national training centers, you're going to start to see us, as we go through training rotations, that this will be part of this. Training and Doctrine Command is currently running a series of seminars that they're looking at how we develop leaders for this environment, how we develop tactical and operational concepts to operate in the future environment, and how do we incorporate the lessons that we've learned over the last 10 years. So I think after we get the results of this work done by TRADOC, we'll then look at updating our operational concept and look at where we want to go. And the last point I would make, and I don't want to take too much time, is and then this relationship between conventional and special operations forces and how that's changed over time and the benefits we've gotten through the integration and synchronization between conventional and special operations forces and how that fits into the operational concept. I think those are some of the things that we're going to focus on.
So as you look left and right to your sister services and you think about it in view of the joint force, and I'll just share that the concern that I have is that as we look at the joint operational concepts, so we look at the potential employment, I'm just concerned that we haven't, and for good reason, over the last decade, we've been very involved in achieving these objectives in the Central Command AOR, but that we've actually done all the planning, the detailed planning, have added up, have done the math to look at what's required to move the force, the risk associated, the timeline. And as I look at 301 platform, United States Air Force, I consider the Navy's dimension in this, and then I think about the joint force delivery. If we ever, we pray it isn't the case that we have to deploy it for a major theater war, but we know that if we're ready, there's less chances that we'll have to, particularly when we exercise it and demonstrate it to the world that we have that capability. I'm just concerned we haven't really done yet the detailed planning and then looked at the experimentation that's required, the exercising that's required, the information ops that would go with that, and would look to you to sort of assuage those concerns.
No, I don't disagree. In fact, it's a couple of things. Let me just add to, as I look back, it's about unity of effort. It's about understanding the different dimensions of warfare. I didn't get into information operations, cyber warfare, all of those things that now must be incorporated in our joint operational concepts. we're currently doing that. It's about understanding and how we develop these in training our headquarters at all variety of levels, and that's all part of this as well. And I concur with what you said.
Thank you, gentlemen. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Gentlemen, I want to talk with you a little bit about TRICARE and the proposed rate increases. Currently, our families are paying about $460 for the TRICARE Prime. By 2017, that would move to $2,048 under the proposal. And this past year, if I'm not mistaken, we asked that those rate increases be limited to the increases in the retirement plan. Is that not correct?
You have to restate. I'm sorry, Mr. Scott. Could you say that again?
The rate increases for the TRICARE Prime, y'all have asked us to allow you to go from $460 to $2,048. That's a significant increase to people who have earned that benefit. And quite honestly, I come from a risk management background. To me, that seems like something that if industry did that, that would be an indication that they were trying to actually push people out of it and shut the program down. And I guess my question is that the intent of the significant rate increases?
No, absolutely not. And one of the critical parts of this to consider, if you will, even after the full increases are into effect at the end of 17, that rate will, by every reasonable projection, still be a very generous rate compared to an equal policy in the private sector, if you could obtain such an equal policy. I said earlier, this is not something that we were particularly happy to do, and it was not something that we did do rather without a great deal of thought and consideration. And after we talked about this amongst ourselves, all the service chiefs, all the service secretaries, all the command sergeant majors and master chiefs of the Navy, we decided that this was absolutely essential to preserve the benefit. As we tried to do is to tailor it and to layer it in a way that only those people who are of retired age, under the age of 65, and are likely to be working and based on their rank would receive the greater of those increases.
Mr. Secretary, if I could, sure. I'm sorry, I only get 5 minutes.
That's fine.
So I don't mean to interrupt, but you know, it amazes me that in this time that we're in, that we continue to take and take and take from the military under this administration, and yet for somebody who hasn't paid their dues, if you will, like our military service members have, there's no proposed reductions for food stamps, and in fact, there's no meaningful reductions for any of the entitlement programs that truly are driving this country off a fiscal cliff. With that said, for the retirement changes that are proposed, you've proposed to go to a BRAC-like commission, which would be a straight up or down vote by the Congress, and would essentially not allow for the individual input of the members of Congress. Why do you believe that that is a better route than to go through the normal committee process?
Well, I'm glad you used the word better and not best, because there's no good way to go about this. As Secretary Gates said, as he looked at the retirement system the military currently employs, we ought to ask some questions about the fairness of it. We ought to ask some questions about perhaps configuring it in a way that would allow people to vest more early. Would that, in fact, help us to recruit and ultimately retain folks in a different and hopefully better fashion? And it seems to me that the best way to go about that, as we saw through the BRAC process, is to do it through an independent body. If it's the opinion of this Congress to do it differently, well, that's something I'm sure you can talk about with the administration. But let me just say why we looked at this health care proposal. Number one,
Secretary, I'm sorry, I'm down to about 45 seconds. And I apologize but again, it's a reduction in benefits to those who protect our personal freedoms and individual liberties, and quite honestly, economic opportunities for other Americans. But the President refused to make any proposal to deal with the entitlement benefits for those that aren't contributing. One last thing: the traumatic brain injury is certainly an issue that we have done a better job of that. I want to commend you for the work that's been done there. Some of the gentlemen that I have met with spoke very positively about the use of the hyperbolic chambers, the same way you would treat bends, and the benefit that they had from using those machines, yet the VA has refused to pay for that. I'm out of time. I would appreciate it if you would work with us, with the VA, to make sure that those service members that do have that traumatic brain injury can receive that treatment.
But we have 5 programs in the Department of Defense, including the Army, that are currently looking at the efficacy of that. I've said if those programs prove promising, I'm not going to wait for the FDA or anyone else will authorize that treatment.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Schilling.
Thank you, Chairman. Ranking Member Smith, first I would like to thank you two gentlemen for your dedication to not only our country but to our warfighters. It's greatly appreciated. Just a couple of things quickly. What I was wondering, Secretary McHugh, I've been aware of a study that's been done, been ongoing to address the organic base in the future. And I was just wondering, do you know when we might see that plan, or maybe when it's going to be released?
I believe you're referring to the Department of Defense's S2T2 sector-by-sector, tier-by-tier analysis. That actually started in 2011. I do not believe DOD has placed a timeline on it, but obviously these issues are relevant and current, and we're working, as all the services are, with DOD to bring it to a conclusion so we can make some decisions and plot a way forward.
Very good. Thank you, sir. And then, General, one of the things that I'm concerned about is that as we do these the cutbacks, and I'm sure you're concerned also, but one of the things that's really important is the Rock Island Arsenal, which is one of the areas that myself and then Mr. Loebsack represent. But back in 2006, when our troops were faced with the IEDs that would rip through the non-armored doors in their vehicles, the Arsenal was the group that were basically stepped up and took this challenge, and within 3 weeks they were able to turn these doors around. The Frag 5 kits is what they call them, and which allowed the private sector or the folks outside to get these things out. And that's one of the main concerns that we want to make sure is, just because this the turnaround was faster than the industry could ever do, and that's one of the things when it comes to the warfighters, is to make sure we keep those warmed up, of course. So.
Again, it's about having that organic capacity that enables us to respond quickly, and it's about developing the core capabilities that we want to sustain within our organic capacity, and that's what we're watching. The Secretary and I watch that very carefully. General Dunwoody, the Commander of Army Materiel Command, watches this very carefully, and that's something we will not sacrifice and don't want to as we move forward.
Awesome. Thank you for your service. I yield back.
Mr. Platts.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, General Odierno, always a pleasure and privilege to be in your company. John, for your service here many years, and allow me to try to fill your shoes here on the committee when you went over to the department. And General Odierno, I think I first met you in Kirkuk many years back, and I've always been amazed at your great leadership and humbled to be able to work in any capacity with you. We're a blessed nation because of both of you in your service to the nation and to the men and women in the Army and their families. They're all in good hands because of both of your leaderships. I'm going to try to be quick because I may be the last one holding you from getting out the door. And I think the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Reyes, may have raised the issue of the modernization of the Bradley fighting vehicle. Say up front, BAE is a great employer in my district and is a wonderful company to work with, but more importantly, they build an incredible piece of equipment in the Bradley. And the concern that I think Mr. Reyes raised, I would just echo that in looking at the 013 budget request for modernization of the Bradley, it looks like it would require a shutdown of the operating line at some point. And my worry is what the cost will be to restart it, but maybe even more importantly, the ability to restart it because of the loss of that skilled labor force that is incredible, including many veterans of Vietnam and wars since, including the most recent. When I visit there, the plant, I usually run into some guardsmen who who are now back on the line building the vehicles that they and others were benefited from in the combat theater. So I guess I first would just echo his concern and encourage any and all efforts that we can to find a way to not allow that line to shut down and the consequences that may come from that, both financially and, again, most importantly, from the ability to restart it with a skilled labor force that is unmatched by any other. Related to that is my understanding also that the Army's engineer forces, that their Bradleys are not the most upgraded and comparable to the Bradleys or M1 tanks that are found in the other elements of the Heavy Combat Brigade team. And is it possible to look at those upgrades to bring them up to par, and so we're all on the same level, as also a way to then prevent that shutdown and again the consequences. So appreciate your consideration of those concerns as you look at how to balance the books and make it all work. And I know you have a difficult assignment, and take that assignment very seriously. A final issue, if I can just put on your related to upgrades, is the 4-year testing schedule for the Paladin howitzer system. And if there's any ability to expedite that, that seems like a pretty lengthy process for what is basically an upgrade of a current system, not a new system. So another concern. Appreciate your service and leadership, and having the privilege to represent the Army War College and AHEC. It's been a remarkable honor to serve on this committee. In my final year, as I'll leave Congress at the end of this year and see what happens next. But serving on this committee and having the privilege to interact with true American heroes such as both of you in your service has been something I'll always treasure. So if you'd like to respond to any of those concerns, I'd be grateful.
First of all, I want to wish you on a personal level all the best in the future. I truly enjoyed the opportunity to serve with you, and you do great work, and Army-centric here, but your very effective representation was very moving to me personally. We share your concerns on the industrial base. We've talked about it several times. The Bradley program is turning down, and we're working as we are in other facilities to try to find ways to fill those gaps, particularly for the higher end employee positions, the engineers, the highly trained technicians, et cetera, and whether, as I've mentioned before, through PPPs or through foreign military sales. You mentioned the other services. Obviously, we're willing to consider all kinds of solutions to this, and one of the reasons we're working with the department so we can have a cross-services approach to our industrial-based challenges. And the Secretary Panetta has made this a critical issue of his, and we're working with him very diligently to try to ensure that we have some answers.
Just very quickly again, thank you, sir, for your service and continued service to the nation and what you've done, and wish you best of luck as you move forward. There's some things we're looking at. There's some programs, suspension and track programs that we're trying to put in there to help sustain that base, and we'll continue to work that over the next several years to make sure we sustain a readiness level there. With the Paladin program and the testing, this is something that the Secretary and I are looking at throughout all our programs, is the cost and amount of testing that we are doing, sometimes redundant. Yeah. And so we're going to work very carefully with Congress in order to try to reduce the cost and length of some of our testing that is required, and we agree with your assessment of that.
Well, and as I said at the beginning, I know we're in good hands as you try to make this all fit and work, to have the final product be what we need for our Army and ultimately for our nation's defense. And we do plan to be back in theater at least once or twice more. I think it would be number 9 to Afghanistan and 12 to Iraq if that works out, even with the drawdown. So bring fudge. Yeah. I'll make a note. Next time I see you, I'll have some of my mom's peanut butter fudge. So, Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary General. Thank you for joining us today. The new defense strategy and budget requests reflect the hard work and forward thinking of President Obama, our DoD civilian leaders, and our senior military commanders. I've been saying all week that ominous and exaggerated fears about the national security consequences of reduced growth in the defense budget are certainly unfounded. There's no way a 1% reduction in the Pentagon's base budget from 2012 to 2013 could mean the difference between the greatest military known to man or a hollowed-out force. And the American people, I think, understand that. In fact, I believe there's room for further savings in the department's budget, though I strongly oppose the across-the-board cuts that would be imposed by sequestration. General Odierno, is it your assessment that Afghan national security forces are on pace to self-sufficiently defend Afghan's sovereignty and defeat insurgents by the end of 2014? And also, I'd like for you to respond, General, to the February 1st quote of Secretary Panetta when he said that hopefully we could reach a point in the latter part of 2013 that we could make the same kind of transition we made in Iraq from a combat role to a train and assist role. What is your interpretation of Secretary Panetta's remarks?
Thank you, Mr. Johnson. First, I think that we've seen continued increase in capabilities of the Afghan security force. I was there just before, I got back day before Christmas from there. I'm encouraged by the progress that's been made by the Afghan security forces. I think as you see us move forward, we are putting them more and more in front. I think we'll continue to do that. As we learned in Iraq, it's important to do this slowly, do it right, but ensure that they are ready to take over so there's no backward movement. I think we're on the right track. In terms of Secretary Panetta's comments, I would say all along our strategy is to turn over responsibility to the Afghan security forces. And I think that as we continue to make progress, General Allen and others on the ground will make the decision exactly when this happens. But I think we all agree with Secretary Panetta that over time we're going to turn responsibility over to Afghan security forces. We will move back from combat operations, allow them to take the lead. And we will do that when the time is right. The end of 2013 might be the time we do that. But that will be a continual assessment that goes on. We've had open conversations with Secretary Panetta on this subject. I know that's his judgment as well. And I think he was stating what his estimate would be right now, and we'll continue to assess that as we move forward.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, the fiscal year 2011 defense authorization required the Department of Defense to provide Congress with a full analysis of alternatives for the ground combat vehicle. We still have not received that analysis of the alternatives. And when will we get it?
Well, we're pardon me. We're working through the dictates of the congressional mandate, but also what would be our normal procurement. And part of that, as you just noted, is an analysis of alternatives and also an analysis of non-developmental platforms as well. Our current plan, I think, calls for 2014 on the next step for that. So hopefully at the end of this year, we'll have some input for you and get back to you. I don't recall the legislation itself had a specific deadline.
But I would tell you we're aggressively going after this. It's not only developmental, but we do want to look at non-developmental items in this, and that is clearly part of the process that we will go through. And once we meet milestone A, as part of that will be non-developmental potential capabilities that we could accept at that time. That's part of this open competition that we want to continue to have as we develop these systems and programs.
Thank you. And General, how much is the ground combat vehicle going to cost, and at what unit production cost would the GCV become prohibitively expensive?
Well, I'll have to get back to the prohibitive part. I'm not sure yet. We'll have to wait until they give us what we think the capabilities of the vehicle will be before we understand those costs. but I can give you more of a ballpark, and I can get back with you on that, sir.
All right, thank you, and I'll yield back. Thank you both for your service to the country.
Thank the gentleman. Chair will now recognize himself for possibly the last question, as long as no one else walks in. But both of you, Secretary and General, thank you for being here and your testimony. I've kind of I have two questions, but they pertain generally to readiness and reset. And obviously, first question is, to what extent is it important to maintain the current funding level for reset of equipment for home station training at places like in my district, we have Joint Base McGuire-Dix Lakehurst. Despite the planned reduction in of over 100,000 Army and Marine troops. And the second question is, kind of relays into that, what is the rationale for the Army's decision to increase reset funding over the FY12 appropriated levels despite personnel reductions under the FY12 budget?
A couple things. First, the increase has to do with, as we reset, it's about resetting the equipment coming out of Iraq and Afghanistan, and that equipment will be used to continue to properly man and equip our active and reserve component forces. So if we don't reset this equipment properly, we will not be at the right readiness levels. So it's absolutely essential that we get this reset dollars. And the reason it's increased is because of this coming out of Iraq, more equipment coming back, the equipment coming out of Afghanistan, coming back to the United States. So it's important that we have this funded this year.
It's up there on the priority list.
It's very high on the priority list for us in order for us to sustain our overall readiness.
The other thing I would mention, Mr. Chairman, on training, we have some risk in training funding through this program, through 17. But one of the advantages of taking a 5-year look is that each year we have the opportunity to reanalyze where we are to make sure that we're financed and resourced across the array of needs, and training is a very important part of that. So we're going to have to be working that hard going into 14, 15, particularly 15 and 16, and we recognize that challenge out there, and it's something we're focused on very carefully.
Just to kind of piggyback off that, though, as we have the need for the reset and, say, the mechanics to do that, and we're reducing personnel, is that well within your vision? You're very aware of that could be a legitimate problem where you have a lot of equipment to fix and you have the funding levels and you don't have the personnel to do the maintenance.
Part of this is to fund it in our organic capability that we have within the Army at our depots and arsenals, and that's where we see the most of the reset work being done. And that's why it's so critical to have the funding. So if we don't get the appropriate funding, we will not have the people that will allow us to conduct this reset. But it would be done by mostly civilian governmental employees that operate within our depots, arsenals, that will conduct the majority of the reset work.
That really goes back very effectively to the conversations we've had a number of times today with respect to how do we sustain our organic depots, how do we keep our places like that employed and up to speed. It also underscores the need for OCO funding, because a great share of that reset money will come out of those OCO fund accounts, and not just while we're at theater of war, as we've talked earlier today. We need that OCO line for at least 2 years, we hope 2 to 3 years after the cessation of hostilities.
Well, thank you, and that's all I have, and that being we're all alone in here. Thank both of you for being here, taking the time out, your testimony. This committee looks forward to working with you as we service the men and women of our armed services. And with that being said, the hearing is adjourned.